Everyone, it's your boy Akil again. Sorry for the again extended delay. Many of you already know I've been having some problems with my left knee for the past 6 months, and so I had another extended hospital stay that precluded me from sharing these videos with you. I was pretty sure the last thing y'all wanted to see was me in one of those ridiculous hospital gowns, with my hair less than properly coiffed. Even now it may leave something to be desired, and my surroundings not really conducive to thoughts on public policy and things of that nature. So I decided to wait till I got out of the hospital. Now I'm out. The issue I want to discuss today is really sort of the big picture issue concerning what's going on in Iraq today. Now, of course, President Obama has requested congressional authorization for the use of military force to defeat the Islamic State, also known as ISIS. I'm not going to get too deep into the issue of the congressional authorization right now, although I have a lot of thoughts on that I will share with you before long. I just wanted to make sure everyone knows that this issue of the U.S. having to re-intervene in Iraq after having supposedly pulled out is not unprecedented historically. It has a very strong historical precedent in the experience of the British Empire in what is today considered Iraq, dating back to the 1920s. Now, many of you probably already know that during World War I, the British and the French promised the Arab peoples that if they rose up against the Ottoman or Turkish imperialists who had ruled them for centuries, then the British and the French would help them and guarantee them their independence once the war was over. Once the war was over in 1918, the British and the French broke their promise and carved up the Middle East between them, colonially. Not surprisingly, many Arabs were dissatisfied with that state of affairs and rebelled against the British and the French. One of the areas where that rebellion took place was Mesopotamia, which is today known as Iraq. Now, many of you may have seen the film Lawrence of Arabia from 1961. The hero of that film, T.E. Lawrence, portrayed by Peter O'Toole, was a British war hero from World War I who helped the Arabs in what was then Mesopotamia to free themselves from Turkish rule, from Ottoman rule. But then he became disillusioned with the British colonial administration that took over after the time. I remember reading about this in an article in Foreign Affairs magazine back in 2006 when I was still in college. T.E. Lawrence actually ended up turning against that colonial occupation and whipping up opposition to it in domestic British politics. And so that became a major controversy in British politics in the 1920s and early 30s, in much the same way that the U.S. role in Iraq has been controversial in American politics in the 2000s and early 2010s. Now, the way that Iraq basically went to hell in a handbasket in the last decade is very similar to the way that it went to hell in a handbasket in the 1920s under British colonial occupation. The British actually tried to leave behind them some kind of stable civil society institutions that would hopefully lead to a democratic framework in the future, but they failed. And Iraq itself ended up descending into an insurgency that the British had a great deal of trouble quelling. What's more, Iraq, as the British termed it, became a target for a lot of fundamentalists and radicals from the rest of the Middle East who began infiltrating the country and just generally adding to the firestorm that took place there, that the British increasingly had trouble keeping a lid on. And so, sooner or later, even the British authorities who claimed publicly that they had to stick around in order to keep Iraq under wraps and, make it into a stable society, privately began to realize that they would have to pull out sooner or later. And so, eventually they did pull out in the early 1930s. But guess what happened? After the pullout, the country actually descended even further into chaos. Different factions, Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish, began fighting for power in the country. The Civil War intensified, and the British still kept relatively a hands-off approach to the country. What they didn't recognize was that there was a possibility that the country might fall into the worst possible hands. In the end, guess what happened? A dictatorship came to power that actually, this is around 1939, believe it or not, just as the Second World War was beginning. That dictatorship came to power, and by 1941, they actually offered Iraq up to the Axis powers, namely to Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, as an ally. They offered to ally themselves with Hitler in 1941 at the worst possible time. Now, this would have been just really the worst possible development for the British and for the Allies in the Second World War, particularly if Iraq's immense stores of oil had become available to the Nazi war machine in 1941 when the Nazis were attacking Russia and so on. Also, it meant that the British were faced, as that Foreign Policy magazine article that I mentioned to you mentioned, if they were, the British were faced with the prospect of an Axis ally straddling their lines of communication to India, which was the British considered their most important colony at that time. So guess what the British had to do? After having occupied it, after having tried to democratize it and pacify the country, and then after having more or less failed to do that, but still after having quelled the violence to some extent and then pulled out, the British ended up having to invade Iraq all over again. And guess what happened as British troops approached Baghdad? The Iraqi military at that time slaughtered hundreds of Iraqi Jews as sort of a parting shot before the British were able to take over again. And then the British had to occupy the country all over again until 1948. And that second occupation certainly did not end up succeeding, because otherwise the U.S. would not be bogged down in Iraq today the way that it is. Not to mention any number of other countries that feel the need to intervene in Iraq today, thanks to the Islamic State. So I think that's something we all need to keep in mind. What's going on in Iraq today has a historical precedent. Okay, what the Bush administration tried to do there, others tried to do before them, and it's this just goes to show that President Bush had that much less of an excuse for not knowing that Iraq might go to pot if he stirred up that hornet's nest and he invaded the country and toppled Saddam's regime. He had that much less of an excuse for not anticipating this kind of outcome, because it actually happened before. In much the same way that the U.S. keeps failing to learn from its own past mistakes in past conflicts such as Vietnam, it also fails to learn from the mistakes of its allies like the British, sometimes in the exact same places, not all that long ago in the span of human history. So that's something that U.S. policymakers definitely need to learn. Unfortunately, other than that Foreign Policy magazine article that I just mentioned again and again, I'm not sure that they are learning that lesson. I'm not sure that the movers and shakers and people who here in this town, in D.C., who make these decisions really learn from the past in the way that they ought to. So that's why I'm putting this video out there. Let's hope that the people, at least, will learn these lessons, and that we'll keep these things in mind on Election Day when it comes time for us to choose our governors and our rulers. Okay, what's going on in Iraq now with the U.S. contemplating reinvading the country, more or less? That's actually happened before. The British did it before. And by all means, I encourage you all to read up on it and research it yourselves. So, that's just my latest missive. Make what you will of it, comment on it, respond to it, react to it, discuss it, and I look forward to hearing from all of you later on. Peace.